Why does a landlocked country in southern Africa holds the largest sheet of falling water on Earth? Zimbabwe sits between the Zambezi and the Limpopo with no coastline, yet its western border hosts a waterfall roughly 1.7 kilometers wide. The Kololo people called it Mosi Oatunya, the smoke that thunders, because the spray rises hundreds of meters and sustains a rainforest in the middle of dry savanna. The answer to how this happened lies in basalt, erosion, and a river that refused to stop. The Zambezi River reaches the western edge of Zimbabwe and drops 108 meters into a basalt gorge. That single plunge creates Victoria Falls, which straddles the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia. Above the falls, the river runs wide and shallow, threading between small forested islands. Below, it funnels into a narrow waterway and carves zigzag gorges through hard volcanic rock. The cliff face runs nearly 2 kilometers, and the full width of the Zambezi pours over it during peak flow between February and April. The spray from Victoria Falls does something unusual. It climbs back above the gorge and falls again as constant rain, sustaining a strip of dense tropical vegetation along the cliff edge. This rainforest exists nowhere else in the surrounding landscape of dry mopane woodland. Rainbows form in the mist at almost any hour. The local Kololo name, Mosi Oatunya, captures what the eye sees first from kilometers away, a column of smoke rising from the ground where no fire burns, audible long before it is visible. The geology beneath Victoria Falls tells a story of persistence. The Zambezi flows over a thick layer of basalt laid down nearly 200 million years ago. Cracks in that basalt gave the river entry points, and over millions of years, the water eroded the rock, carving successive gorges downstream. Each gorge marks an older position of the falls. The current cliff face is simply the latest chapter. The water plunges into a slot so narrow that the spray has nowhere to go but up, feeding the rainforest above. Walking trails along the Zimbabwe side of the gorge let visitors stand close enough to feel the spray on their skin. The path follows the cliff edge through the rainforest, where ferns and fig trees grow in perpetual moisture. On the far side, the landscape changes abruptly. Beyond the strip of green, dry savanna stretches toward the horizon. This contrast between a rainforest sustained by waterfall spray and arid bushland a few hundred meters away defines the ecology around Victoria Falls and shapes where people and wildlife can live. The sheer volume of water passing over Victoria Falls varies dramatically through the year. At peak flow, the entire 1.7 kilometer width of the Zambezi becomes a single unbroken curtain, and the spray can rise 400 meters. At low water, typically in November, parts of the cliff face dry out entirely and the gorge floor becomes visible. This seasonal rhythm controls everything downstream. The rapids below the falls, some of the most powerful in the world, depend on the same river that feeds farms and towns across Zimbabwe. The mist at Victoria Falls is not a side effect, it is the defining feature. During high water months, visibility along the cliff trail drops to a few meters, and the roar of the falls drowns out conversation. The spray drifts across the border into Zambia and settles on rooftops in the town of Victoria Falls, coating everything in fine moisture. This constant water supply allows plant species normally found in the Congo Basin to grow here, more than 1,000 kilometers south of their usual range. Above the falls, the Zambezi runs deceptively calm. Islands of grass and acacia break the surface, and the water barely hints at what lies ahead. Then the river reaches the basalt lip, and the ground simply disappears. Below the falls, the Zambezi enters the Batoka Gorge, a series of tight zigzag canyons carved into basalt. Spanning the first of these gorges is the Victoria Falls Bridge, a steel arch completed in 1905. It was built as part of Cecil Rhodes's plan for a railway stretching from Cape Town to Cairo. The Victoria Falls Bridge connected what were then called Rhodesia and Northern Rhodesia, linking the copper mines of Zambia to ports in the south. The railway never reached Cairo, but the bridge itself became a landmark. At 198 meters long and 128 meters above the Zambezi, it was an engineering achievement for its time. Vehicles still cross it today, carrying freight and passengers between Zimbabwe and Zambia. Below the deck, the river churns through the narrowest section of the gorge, its surface broken by standing waves and basalt outcrops. The Batoka Gorge below Victoria Falls is a product of the same erosion that created the falls. As the river cut backward through basalt over millions of years, it left a chain of gorges stretching downstream for nearly 100 kilometers. The walls are steep and dark, and the vegetation on the gorge floor is sparse compared to the lush rainforest above. On the Zimbabwe side, walking paths along the cliff edge offer direct views into the gorge and across to the bridge, where traffic moves slowly between two countries. The main curtain of Victoria Falls faces west, and the Zimbabwe side holds most of the viewing points. During peak flow, the wall of water is so dense that the opposite cliff disappears behind spray. The sound is physical, a low vibration felt in the ground before it reaches the ears. Small figures on the cliff trail give a sense of scale. The gorge here is more than 100 meters deep, and the basalt walls run straight for hundreds of meters before the river bends into its next zigzag. Upstream of the falls, the Zambezi spreads across a wide, flat plain. Small islands covered in grass and acacia dot the waterway, and the water moves slowly enough that hippos and crocodiles share the shallows. This stretch of river marks the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia for roughly 50 kilometers before the water reaches the cliff edge. Fishermen in dugout canoes work the narrow passages between islands. The river here gives no warning of what lies downstream, flowing broad and calm toward a drop it cannot see. Below the falls, the Zambezi changes character entirely. The river that entered the gorge, broad and placid, exits as a torrent confined between basalt walls, barely 30 meters apart in places. The water runs green and white, boiling over submerged rocks. This section of the river draws commercial rafting operations that run some of the most technical rapids in the world. The gorge itself is a geological record, each bend representing a former position of the waterfall before erosion pushed it upstream to where it stands today. The landscape around Victoria Falls reveals how water shapes a country. The rainforest along the cliff gives way to dry savanna within a few hundred meters, and that savanna stretches east across Zimbabwe for hundreds of kilometers. The Zambezi continues past the falls and the bridge, carving through the Bitoka Gorge before reaching Lake Kariba, a reservoir supplying hydroelectric power to both Zimbabwe and Zambia. The same river that thunders over basalt here will slow to a quiet lake before reaching the Indian Ocean in Mozambique. The Zambezi is the fourth longest river in Africa, flowing nearly 2,600 kilometers from Zambia through Angola, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, and Mozambique before reaching the sea. Above Victoria Falls, the river broadens and slows, its banks lined with riparian forest, where ebony and waterberry trees grow. At dusk, the water turns gold, and the islands cast long reflections. Hippos surface and submerge in the channels. This calm stretch is where river cruises depart each evening, carrying visitors along the same water that will soon plunge over the cliff. Sunset on the Zambezi draws boats onto the water. Small cruisers drift past islands where fish eagles roost, and the bridge stands dark against the fading sky. The gorge landscape here is arid, with thin vegetation clinging to basalt slopes, a sharp contrast to the rainforest above the falls. South of the river, the Kalahari Sands begin, and on those sands sits Hwange National Park. Elephant herds cross that dry ground toward waterholes, following routes their ancestors traced long before the park existed. Hwange National Park covers roughly 14,600 square kilometers on Zimbabwe's western border with Botswana. It sits on deep Kalahari sands that hold almost no surface water, so the park depends on pumped water holes to sustain wildlife through the dry season. Hwange holds one of the largest elephant populations in Africa, with herds that number in the tens of thousands. During the dry months, elephants walk long distances between feeding areas and water, calves staying close to the adults. Giraffe, zebra, and antelope share the same water sources. Hwange's water holes attract more than elephants. Giraffes spread their front legs awkwardly to reach the water, while spur-winged geese gather at the edges. Birds like the blacksmith lapwing raise chicks in the surrounding grass. East of Hwange, the land rises toward Bulawayo, Zimbabwe's second city, founded in the 1890s, with wide avenues still laid out for ox wagons. It remains a rail junction. From the Zambezi's thunder at Victoria Falls to these dry savannas and city grids, Zimbabwe is a country shaped entirely by where its water goes.